This is another damn podcast about digital asset management. I'm Henrik Gyor. Today I'm speaking with Norman Paskin. Norman, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Henrik. Thank you for the invitation.
Norman, how are you involved with digital asset management?
I guess my principal involvement is I manage something called the DOI system. DOI is Digital Object Identifier, run through an organization specifically set up to do that, the International DOI Foundation, which I was involved in founding and I'm currently managing. And the reason for that is if you're managing digital assets, the first thing you need to do is to be able to refer to each asset unambiguously and precisely using a short string, so give it an identifier. And that's what the system was conceived to do back in 1998, came out of the publishing industry, but it was deliberately developed with wide applicability. So if I drill down a little bit into that involvement, I think there are three sorts of involvement I have with DAM. The first is using identifiers on digital networks, what we call resolution. And the DOI system actually uses the handle system, that's handle.net, from CNRI, which is the Corporation for National Research Initiatives. I also do some work with them, just for to be clear, on a consultancy basis. And the handle system was developed by Bob Kahn, who was one of the co-inventors of TCP/IP, to be highly scalable, efficient, extensible, and secure, and so forth. So it's ideal for persistent identifiers and managing unique identifiers. So that's the first area of involvement. The second sort of involvement with DAM, I think, is associating descriptions with those identifiers. Because for asset management, obviously it's not sufficient to have an identifier. You've also got to say what that identifier refers to. Precisely and unambiguously, particularly if someone else is going to be using it. And that takes us into the world of metadata, particularly for intellectual property assets or what people call content. So I've been involved with a number of initiatives dealing with metadata for enabling persistence and interoperability for well over 15 years. The first was the Index project, that's INDECS. 1998. That really set the scene for a number of later initiatives. The most recent of those, just starting, is something called the Linked Content Coalition, run by the European Publishers Council. And what these all have in common is recognizing that in the digital world, convergence means you can be dealing with many different types of things, different content, from many different communities with different sets of standards. So they may not have previously had to work with each other, but they now need a common framework. And also what's come out of that, I think, is recognizing that assets as intellectual property are much more than digital objects. So, for example, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is more than an MP3 file. It's an underlying abstraction, a creation, with all sorts of rights that may be different from the specific digital manifestation. People have investments in all sorts of different data schemes. So the aim has to be to enable people to reuse what they have. And that's part of the effort that we've been involved in. One of the things that's come out of that is something called the Vocabulary Mapping Framework, VMF. Fundamental basis of things like that is a structured ontology approach. Same principle as behind the semantic web and linked data. And what we're offering with DOI is a tool to give you a set of data which is both curated and managed to be reliable. And just to wrap, I think the third way I'm involved is in social infrastructures and governance. The DOI Foundation operates as a federation of independent agencies. So we have a governance model and a set of policies and procedures. It works very well. We're very pleased with progress, although sometimes it seems like herding cats. We have agencies from a number of sectors, US, Europe, China, Japan, so very different views coming forward. And also in the social infrastructure area, I've been involved in a number of standards activities, most recently ISO 26324, which is an effort to take the DOI system and put it into an ISO framework. So technical involvement in identifiers, metadata, and I think governance. That's my involvement.
In May 2012, the ISO, or International Standards Organization, released a new standard regarding a digital object identifier system. Can you tell us more about this new standard you helped develop?
Yes, I was the convener of the working group that did that. But the DOI system, which has now been standardized, actually preceded the ISO working process itself. In effect, the ISO standard 26324 is codifying what already existed. In the early days of the DOI system, 1998, we worked with ISBN, the International Standard Book Number people, and through them we came to the attention of the ISO group involved in that whole topic of bibliographic identifiers. They invited us to consider taking the DOI system and putting it into an ISO standard to gain the advantages of international recognition and a degree of autonomy and independence. But the system that's now been standardized is in effect the DOI system as it was. The DOI system really took off in 2000. ISO got involved in 2004, so a number of years later, and it finally passed as a standard in 2010, so quite a number of years after that. And it's actually only been published now in May 2012. The reason for that delay is purely an ISO thing about they wanted to review all of their generic registration authority contracts, and we got rather caught up in that whole framework. 7.5 years from door to door, but in effect, what ISO has done is taken the DOI system and put it into the ISO framework. I think there's been a lot of advantages to that, by the way, from our point of view. I mean, we've in the working group, we had a number of suggestions for how to improve the wording, for how to consider in particular interoperability with other standards and make sure that was fully recognized in the wording. Avoid some initial misunderstandings, I think, that were about, which was that in some way DOI was trying to replace existing systems, where in fact that's far from the case. Actually, we've encouraged the creation of new registries and new sorts of identifier standards. We've also been involved in new ISO standards like ISTC, which is a standard for textual abstractions, and ISNI, the International Standard Name Identifier. It's been quite a long story, but I think our involvement with ISO has all been good. What it means for the community is I don't think the ISO standardization doesn't make a big deal of difference to people already using DOI. By the time the standard was published, we'd already assigned 60 million DOIs, so clearly people weren't waiting for the standard to come along to use it. But I think that was actually a help in the standards process, the benefit of practical experience of implementation and what worked. So we were able to say, when we, for example, talking about the metadata standard that we wanted to associate, well, in our experience, this is what's practical. This may be a better design over here, but we have to deal with reality at the moment. So that's been quite helpful process. I think ISO standardization is just one of a number of events that's taken place with DI since we started in 2000. And I think we're quite pleased that we're still around after all this time. And we haven't had to make any U-turns, and we seem to be getting a lot of recognition. The publication of the standards actually generated quite a bit of interest from people who may not have been aware of it before. And I think, for example, this interview is a sign of that.
Digital asset management systems, among other enterprise content management solutions, often use various kinds of Digital Object Identifiers, or DOIs, or Unique Identifiers, UIDs. How is this standard applicable across organizations and vendors currently using DOI or UIDs for a variety of digital media?
It's a good question. I think I need to tease apart a couple of the terms there.
Please.
When people talk about Digital Object Identifiers, sort of imagine it all in lowercase, they're using it generically. When they talk about it with capitalized DOI, they're specifically referring to the DOI system, which has got its own set of rules and policies and principles. And actually, DOI is a trademark simply because we wanted to preserve the consistency of the system for that reason. But if you want to work with others to manage, you want to pass on to other parties in a supply chain, or you want to simply make available to third parties that you may not yet know about, you want to simply make them discoverable, then you've probably got to find a way of interoperating and ensuring persistence of your identifiers. And I think that's where we come in. We offer a framework which is effectively out of the box. It's a shared infrastructure, both technical and social, with the benefits of economy of scale, where you can keep your own identifier system and your own metadata, but put it into that framework. You can keep your own autonomy of the community that you're looking after, but take advantage of a system that's becoming increasingly widely known and standardized with standard tools. So a couple of good examples. One of the earliest implementations of DOI was something called Crossref. It's all one word, crossref.org, which uses DOIs to link scholarly publishing articles. And that's a community of now, I think, approaching 4,000 different publishers. But they have their own rules. But the DOI system, as they use it, is the same as anyone else would use the DOI system. So just the common rules of the road. Another example is the Entertainment Identifier Registry, EIDR.org. They're using DOIs in the movie assets, commercial television broadcasting area. And again, they're using the same system, technically, same social infrastructure, but they also lay on top of that their own social infrastructure for their own community and their own rules about what they cover. What the DOI system offers, I think, is an ability to not throw away what you've already been using, but to make it more usable with other systems and to make it persistent. And of course, in detail, we offer some common tools free of charge, license to the handle system for resolution, tools like the vocabulary mapping framework, some common technical infrastructure and so forth. But that's not the most important thing. Anyone can build their own infrastructure if they want to. I think what we offer really is a community, a very large community of interest, greater together than people would be working on their own.
And what advice would you like to share with DAM professionals and people aspiring to become DAM professionals?
I've thought about this. I think a number of points, really. Almost at the top of the list, I would say don't reinvent the wheel. And I don't just mean use DOIs. A lot of useful work has already been done. When we designed the DOI system, again, we didn't reinvent the wheel. We used existing components. I think what a lot of technical people don't necessarily realize is that things like ontologies and classification work in the 60s, things like library cataloging tools, which people may consider to be rather old-fashioned, actually solved an awful lot of problems about organization of information and contextual ontologies, things like FRBR, which the libraries came up with some time ago. So that's one point, don't reinvent the wheel. I would say also look beyond your immediate community, because digital convergence means you can't afford to think only about your immediate problems if you're going to have something that lasts and is extensible. And I do realize there is a tension there, of course. If you're looking for cost justification, there is a tendency to look, first of all, to your own community, and secondly, to be relatively short term. So I think a related point is think for the long term. You've got to use a technology, but don't forget the possibilities for migration to other technologies. Don't forget things like thinking at the right level of abstraction, extensibility and scalability. A further point, I think, is we often talk about persistence, identifiers being around for a while, and we often talk about interoperability. I think they're two sides of the same coin, which is persistence is simply interoperability with the future. I would say also something that I found running the social organizations that I've been involved in for 15 years, it's very easy to get involved in arguments about definitions. That's pointless. Don't argue about definitions. It's futile. But what you do need to do is try to be explicit and clarify what you mean and understand what someone else means. They may have a legitimate reason for thinking differently than you. Common terms, I think, like identifier, like stakeholders, like community. When people use them, they often have a sort of a vested interest or a shading towards their particular understanding of what that term means. So try to understand where they're coming from. And the final thing, which is not my motto, but it was attributed to Einstein, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So don't assume that the obvious solution is always the right one.
Great points. Well, thanks, Norman.
Pleasure.
For more on this and other digital asset management topics, log on to anotherdamblog.com. Another Dam podcast is available on Audioboo, iTunes, and the Tech Podcast Network. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to email me at anotherdamblog@gmail.com. Thanks again.